Welcome to the Compliance Officer's Playbook podcast. Today
Yeah.
we're diving deep into some materials you sent us, and it's some pretty intense stuff, basically outlining a whole new U.S. government strategy for targeting cartels and, what are they called, transnational criminal organizations?
Yeah.
Or TCOs.
Yeah, TCOs.
Yeah.
And I think what's so interesting about this is it goes way beyond like typical drug busts.
Right.
This is
Yeah.
really looking at almost like a reshaping of the legal landscape to try to dismantle these groups entirely.
Right. It's not just like a policy memo or something. We've got a presidential executive order and a memo from the Attorney General to every single person
Yeah.
at the Justice Department. Yeah. And the language is really strong, too. Like, one of them declares a national emergency, and the other one says the goal is total elimination.
Yeah, that total elimination piece is really key.
Yeah.
Because how do you actually achieve that against groups that are this deeply entrenched with resources and influence that honestly rival some nations?
Yeah. How do you even begin to do that? So let's unpack this a little bit. Starting with the executive order itself, it was issued on January 20, 2025 by then President Trump.
Oh, wow. So right after inauguration. That's interesting. It seems like this was really high on the agenda, maybe even like a response to something specific that we don't know about.
Right. So this executive order really focuses on designating cartels and groups like MS-13 and Tren de Aragua as foreign terrorist organizations or especially designated global terrorists.
Okay. That's a big shift.
That's a big shift.
Yeah. Huge implications. Like, think about it. If they're classified as terrorists, all of a sudden the U.S. government can use a whole bunch of different tools, legal tools, financial weapons, to try to disrupt them that they couldn't use before.
And they lay out the reasoning for that pretty clearly in the executive order. They're arguing that cartels aren't just a crime problem, they're a national security threat.
Okay. So they list out, all the
violence,
the control over these smuggling routes, how they essentially are the government in some parts of Mexico. And then even like these alleged ties to terrorists or other hostile foreign governments.
Right. And they really emphasize impact on the U.S.
with,
the flow of deadly drugs and violent criminals and gangs coming across the southern border.
Right. They're really hitting that point home.
Yeah.
So then they declare a national emergency using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
Oh, IEPA.
PEA.
What is that?
That gives the president huge power to do things like impose sanctions, freeze assets, restrict financial transactions. It's a big deal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it doesn't stop there. The Secretary of State has 14 days to recommend specific groups for that terrorist designation. So that's a really tight deadline, which makes me think that they were already building a case.
Oh, yeah. Wow. But here's where it gets really intense. The executive order tasks the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security with getting ready for the potential use of the Alien Enemies Act.
The Alien Enemies Act.
The Alien Enemies Act.
Wow. So if they invoke that, that totally changes how the U.S. government deals with immigration, especially for anyone associated with these groups. And it brings up some really serious questions about due process.
Yeah. So now let's move on to that Attorney General memo. That was issued February 5th, 2025. It's addressed to everyone in the Justice Department, and it really lays out the specifics of this total elimination policy.
Right. And they really stress that this is about wiping these groups off the map, not just playing whack-a-mole with arrests.
Yeah. And they have some very clear charging priorities. So leaders and managers, they're going after them with the most serious charges they can.
Okay. So we're talking capital crimes, terrorism charges, racketeering, drug kingpin violations, IEPA violations. They're really pulling out all the stops.
Wow. But for low-level members, the focus shifts to getting them out of the U.S. rather than, bogging down the courts with prosecutions.
Oh, okay. So it's almost like a recognition that this is such a massive undertaking that they need to be strategic and focus resources on the top players and streamline the process for the smaller fish.
Right. Okay. So then they go on to outline the factors prosecutors should consider before they bring charges, make arrests, or extraditions. So things like their leadership role, their ties to the U.S., harm caused to U.S. citizens, involvement in terrorism, even whether non-criminal responses might be enough.
Interesting. So this is where it gets really tricky. They're trying to balance this aggressive action with the potential for blowback, unintended consequences, diplomatic fallout. It's really hard to do.
Yeah. So They're cutting through a lot of the red tape. That usually slows down these prosecutions.
Because it makes sense in this kind of fight. Against organizations that are so agile, you want to be able to move quickly and decisively.
Right.
So what are they doing?
So they're suspending the mandatory pre-indictment review for capital crimes. They're easing approval requirements for terrorism and IEPA charges.
Okay, so they're streamlining these processes, trying to make it easier to get these prosecutions going faster, basically making life harder for these groups.
Yeah. So the memo also, it reprioritizes things within the Justice Department. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act unit, which normally focuses on corporate bribery, is now going to prioritize cases that help cartels and TCOs.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So that's smart because they're understanding that if you target the corrupt officials who enable these groups, then you can disrupt their networks and you can cut off their money.
Right. And the money laundering and asset recovery section
Right.
is also going after cartels and TCOs.
Yeah.
It's a top priority now.
Yeah. Hit them where it hurts. The finances, seizing assets, disrupting money laundering operations. It all weakens their ability to operate.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. They're actually redirecting resources from kleptocracy initiatives, which normally target corrupt foreign officials, to focus on this cartel elimination effort.
Wow. That's a huge shift in resources. That shows you just how seriously they're taking this.
Right. Existing task forces are getting empowered, too. So JTF Vulcan, which targets MS-13, is being expanded to include Tren de Aragua, and JTF Alpha, which focuses on human trafficking, is now prioritizing cartel-linked operations.
Okay. So task forces, that's where they combine expertise and resources from different agencies, which you need when you're going after these complex criminal networks. So it allows for a much more coordinated attack.
And both JTFs are being elevated, so they're reporting directly to the Attorney General's office.
Oh, wow. That's a clear sign that this is a top priority.
Yeah.
It shows a high level of commitment and ensures that these task forces have the resources they need to get things done.
Right. The memo also pushes for some legislative changes to strengthen counter-narcotics efforts.
So they're not just relying on what they have, they're actively trying to make the legal tools even stronger to combat these threats.
Right. So they want permanent Schedule A status for all fentanyl-related substances, which is the most restrictive category for drugs with no medical use and high potential for abuse.
Right. So that makes it much easier to prosecute anyone involved with fentanyl.
Right. They also want to add xylazine, which is a dangerous fentanyl additive.
Yeah.
To Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act.
Xylazine.
Xylazine.
Okay. Yeah. And why that one?
Because it makes fentanyl even more dangerous and harder to treat.
Oh, wow.
So it's a growing problem, and this is a direct response to that.
Got it.
And they also want to expand laws
Well,
to cover fentanyl manufacturing equipment, not just the drug itself,
sure.
and they want to require tracking of pill press machines that are used to make counterfeit pills.
So they're really trying to close any loopholes, give law enforcement more tools to go after the entire fentanyl supply chain from production to distribution.
It's amazing.
They're not messing around.
They're not messing around. I mean, it's overwhelming, the sheer scope of what they're going after. One thing that I was really struck by is they keep highlighting that this isn't just about drugs anymore.
Right. It's not just a narcotics issue. These organizations are into everything. I mean, human trafficking, extortion, money laundering, cybercrime. They're constantly diversifying their activities and becoming more sophisticated.
And their reach is global. It's not just across the U.S.-Mexico border.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're talking networks that span continents. It's a truly transnational threat. And they're constantly evolving, using advanced technology, corrupting officials at all levels, exploiting weaknesses in the global financial system.
Yeah, which makes them really hard to fight. It's not like you can just arrest a few kingpins and call it a day.
Right. You can't just play whack-a-mole. You have to really go after their entire infrastructure, disrupt their finances, their supply chains, their recruitment, basically prevent them from operating anywhere.
And that requires international cooperation, which can be tough.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got, countries with weak governments or rampant corruption.
Yeah, it can be a huge challenge. And then there's also the issue of public perception. Like, how do you balance this aggressive law enforcement with the risk of alienating communities or violating civil liberties?
Yeah, that's a really tough line to walk because you can't effectively fight these groups without the trust and cooperation of the people they impact.
Right, exactly. If you come in too heavy-handed, it could really backfire.
Yeah.
Creating more resentment and actually undermining legitimate law enforcement efforts.
Yeah, so it seems like the approach has to be tough, but also smart and sensitive
Mm.
to all these different factors.
Absolutely. It needs to be adaptable. And you have to be really aware of potential blowback, whether it's intentional or not. There's always that risk of escalation
Yeah.
or retaliation or innocent people getting caught in the crossfire.
Right.
And you also have to think about the long game. Like, even hypothetically, if they do manage to eliminate these specific groups,
Mm.
what happens then?
Yeah, will new ones just pop up to fill the void?
Exactly. It's like a hydra. You cut off one head and two more grow back. Because organized crime really thrives on these underlying social and economic problems.
Yeah.
So if you only treat the symptoms without addressing the root causes, it's going to reappear in some new form.
So it's almost like it's not just about taking down these organizations. It's about creating a society, both here and abroad, where these kinds of networks can't even flourish in the first place.
Exactly. It's about tackling things like poverty, inequality, corruption, lack of opportunity, all the things that make people vulnerable to recruitment by these groups.
Yeah. You know, circling back to the documents, I was struck by how much they focused on fentanyl. It's clearly their top concern.
Yeah, it's a game changer, no question about it.
Why is that?
Well, it's so potent. It's incredibly cheap to produce, and it's really easy to smuggle. It's driving this overdose crisis that's devastating communities all over the country.
So the memo pushes for several legal changes to really target this fentanyl problem, like making all fentanyl analogs Schedule 1, going after the equipment used to make it, tracking pill presses.
Right, they're trying to cut it off at the source, choke off the supply, make it harder to produce, and more risky to traffic.
Right.
But the thing is, it's not just about cracking down on the supply. There's this huge demand for opioids, driven by addiction and a lack of access to treatment.
Right.
So you need to address that side of it too. Expand access to treatment and recovery programs, reduce the stigma around addiction, promote harm reduction strategies.
Yeah.
It has to be a comprehensive approach.
I mean, these documents, they're intense. It seems like the U.S. government is really taking this threat seriously.
Oh yeah, no doubt. This is a major escalation.
But as we've been talking about, it's a really complex problem. No easy solutions.
It's basically a declaration of war.
Wow.
But it's not a war you can win with brute force alone. It requires a really nuanced strategy, intelligence, cooperation, and a long-term commitment to addressing those underlying conditions that allow these groups to flourish.
Which brings us back to that whole total elimination goal. Is that even realistic? Or are we just setting ourselves up for disappointment?
That's the big question, isn't it? We have to remember, these organizations are incredibly adaptable. They're resilient. They've been around for decades. They've survived crackdowns before. They will find ways to adapt to this new pressure.
So maybe it's more about viewing this as a long-term struggle, a constant push and pull, rather than expecting some kind of decisive victory.
Right, it's about staying flexible, adapting our strategies as we go, and learning from our mistakes.
But also being transparent about it.
Right.
The public needs to know what's going on, why, and what the costs and benefits are.
Absolutely. Transparency and accountability are crucial.
Yeah, because this policy, it has huge implications.
It does.
For human rights, civil liberties, international relations.
All of that.
This needs to be carefully considered
Mm,
and openly debated.
agreed. And we can't forget about the human cost either. I mean, these organizations, they cause incredible suffering. Individuals, families, entire communities devastated by their activities.
So our efforts to fight them should never make things worse.
Right. We have to hold ourselves to the highest standards. Human rights, due process, the rule of law.
Yeah.
Those principles can't be compromised.
So it seems like these documents, they're really just a starting point.
Yeah, just a glimpse into how the government is thinking. But now it's up to all of us to stay informed, engaged, and to really demand a response that is both effective and ethical.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from national emergency declarations to the Alien Enemies Act. What's your big takeaway from all of this for our listeners? Like the one thing they should really walk away with?
You know, it's tempting to see this as like a good versus evil kind of story.
Yeah.
But it's way more complicated than that. These organizations are deeply embedded in society, both here in the U.S. and in other countries. So this new policy, it's a really big escalation, but it's really just one step in a long and difficult journey.
So it's not just about law enforcement then. It's about understanding the deeper roots of this problem.
Exactly. The social and economic factors.
Yeah.
The poverty, the inequality, the corruption. Those are the things that allow these groups to thrive.
Right. And we can't forget about the demand side either, the addiction crisis.
Absolutely. That's fueling this whole opioid trade.
So we have to address all those underlying issues if we actually want to make a difference.
Yeah.
It's about building a world where people have opportunities and hope, and those criminal networks lose their power.
It's a long-term project,
For sure.
and there are going to be setbacks. These groups are going to adapt.
So what can we do?
We have to stay vigilant. Keep learning. Keep adapting.
And be transparent about it.
Yes, transparency is key.
So the public knows what's going on and why.
And what the potential consequences are.
Because this policy has huge implications
It really does.
for human rights, civil liberties, international relations.
We need to be having those tough conversations about unintended consequences, about balancing security with freedom.
And we can't forget about the human cost.
Of course not. These organizations cause so much suffering.
So our efforts to fight them should never make things worse.
We have to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards. Human rights, due process, the rule of law, those have to be our guiding principles.
It's easy to lose sight of that when you're dealing with such brutal groups.
I know, but we can't. The ends don't justify the means.
So this is just the beginning. These documents give us a glimpse of how the government's thinking, but it's up to all of us to stay informed, to stay engaged,
And to demand
a
better.
response that's both effective and ethical.
I agree.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us and with our listeners.
It's been my pleasure. These are really important conversations to have.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the U.S. government's new strategy against cartels and TCOs. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Compliance Officer's Playbook for more deep dives on the most pressing issues facing compliance professionals today. And for those of you who love the show and want even more, consider becoming a paid subscriber today for $4.99. You'll get full access to all of our premium episodes, packed with even more insights, behind-the-scenes stories, and bonus content you won't find anywhere else. The link to subscribe is in the show notes. Thanks again for listening.